Hi everybody and welcome to today's seminar and book launch of the book EU ETS, Reform Needs in the Light of National Policies. It's our third book for this fall. We're very happy about this one as well, and we're happy to have you guys back for this one. My name is Ruben Henriksson and I'm the Deputy Director of Climate Issues at the think tank Från here in Stockholm. And with me here today, I also have our authors of the day, Lars Zetterberg, who is a researcher or a senior researcher at the IVL Swedish Environmental Research Institute, and Milan Elkerbout, who is a research fellow at CEPS, which is a think tank and forum for debates on EU affairs. And he is also a visiting Mistra fellow at IVL in Stockholm. They are our authors of this book. Our panel today consists of Elin Akinci, who is a co-founder and energy market specialist at ELS Analysis, and Susanna Karp, who is a political strategic advisor at Bellona, a non-profit organization who works to fight climate change. So that is our panel today. This book is also produced together with ELF, or European Liberal Forum, who is the official foundation and think tank of the ALDE party, and they wanted me to send their greetings and say that they are very happy to publish and launch this publication today, and that they are grateful for the fruitful cooperation with Från. So we're grateful as well for that. So I'm just going to start with a short introduction to the ETS to give you all a little bit of background, and then Lars and Milan are going to present the book more specifically. I should also say that you can share your thoughts on Twitter, where you can tag Från Sverige, and you're also very welcome to comment on the YouTube comment section. And in that comment section, we would very much appreciate if you would ask your audience questions there, and I will try to bring them to our panel at the end of this seminar. So please, audience questions in the comment section. You can also download and order the book online at från.se, so please go ahead and check that out. But today's topic, as I said, is the EU ETS, so the European Union Emissions Trading System. And it's the world's largest emissions trading system, covering over 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide. It covers 3 sectors: power installations, energy-intensive industries, and domestic aviation. And as most of you probably know, it's a cap and trade system, meaning we put a cap on the number of emissions allowed, and then we issue emission permits which companies can trade between each others. And the cap is currently lowered by 1.74% per year. This percentage of the linear reduction factor, as it's often called, will be increased to 2.2% per year by 2021. So that is something that's going to happen pretty soon with ETS. Something that also fairly recently happened is that due to the low prices and the excess amount of emission permits, a market stability reserve mechanism was introduced, or the Msr as it's usually called. And the goal was to reduce this excess amount of permits and try to increase the price of emission permits and try to reduce the volatility as well of the price, so we get more consistent price. And in 2022, there's a planned revision or a planned overview of the Msr. So that's going to be a very important year to look at how it's working and what needs to be improved when it comes to the Msr. But today we'll be focusing on mainly 2 subjects. Which reforms do we need of the ETS? And also, how do national policies or companion policies interact with the European emission trading system? And to talk a bit more about that and the 2 chapters in the book concerning this subject, I would like to hand over to Lars Zetterberg and Milan Elkerbout to give a short presentation. And Lars, you're going to share your PowerPoint as well, if I'm correct. And then we have to remember to unmute ourselves, of course. Perfect.
Right, I'll start by sharing my presentation here. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Really good to to be on this seminar, interesting seminar about the EU ETS. This book has been, as you heard, initiated by Forrest, and the writers has been with, aside from Ruben himself, actually, also me and Milan Elkerbout. So I'm going to give you some background here. Why are we looking at this issue right now? So this is where we are. We are soon stepping into the fourth phase of the emissions trading system, starting in January next year. And most rules that determine this phase have already been agreed on in 2017. But there has also been some new reform proposals that came up due to the new Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And these are mentioned in the Green Deal that came about a year ago. There will be proposals on this coming shortly. And there are 5 important issues that we have decided to focus on for this seminar. It's the first one is about ambition, because now we have new climate targets, both for 2030 and for 2050. And it's likely that this will affect also the ambition of the EU ETS. Also, we have a variety of national companion policies that overlap or partly overlap with the EU ETS that also needs to be addressed by the ETS. And an important question there is, how do they handle supply and demand imbalances? So when there is, for instance, too much supply or too little demand of these allowances. And we have, of course, a very recent effect of this with the COVID-19, which has reduced emissions in Europe. We're also going to be discussing a bit about carbon leakage and competitiveness. And finally, the new Commission has proposed that the EU ETS should be extended in its scope to include more sectors. But first out, about ambition. So last week, in fact, the Council decided to take on a new climate target by the year 2030, which should be at least 55% reductions in the EU area. Now, the current or the previous target was minus 40%, and that has been, and the balance between the trading sector and the non-trading sector has been that the trading sector should do a bit more, 43%, while the non-trading sector could do less, 30%. So there's a few things to decide on here. First, what should be the balance between the ETS and non-ETS for this 2030 target? Is it still going to be that the EU ETS should do more? And that's, of course, a political decision. When that is decided, the cap trajectory, so the pace on which the cap is reduced, that has to be updated. And now it's the linear reduction factor that determines this. And from next year, it's going to be minus 2.2%. But that won't reach minus 55% by the year 2030. So that has to be adjusted. And the longer we wait, of course, the more this reduction factor has to be changed. So either to 3% or even more than that. But also, we have a long-term target. So as most of you know, the EU ETS, or Europe has decided on a net zero emissions target by the year 2050. On the other hand, with the current rules, the EU ETS will reach a zero cap in the year 2058. So that's clearly not consistent with a long-term target. So that also has to be updated. For instance, it could mean that there will be a net zero target by the year 2050, but it can also happen earlier. So this raises the question about what will be the end state of the EU ETS. Can we have an emissions trading system with a zero cap? Well, if you look at emissions, of course, they can't reach absolute zero because there will always be residual emissions that are very hard to reduce to zero, for instance, from aviation, but also we think that there will be a large amount of carbon capture and storage in Europe. And this technology is not 100% we don't reach 100% capture rates. So it's very likely that there will be some slip from carbon capture and storage, which means that we will have residual emissions. And how are we going to deal with that if you have a zero cap? Well, one option is to import so-called carbon removal credits, which means that somewhere else you reduce or you create negative emissions, for instance, through bioenergy capture and storage. And this can then render credits that could be imported in the EU ETS. There can also be other types of credits, other types of negative emission technologies. But this has been discussed a lot previously, and often in the context of what's called moral hazard, which means that if you allow for imports of credits, that means that maybe some industries will not be as ambitious in reducing their actual emissions, but instead use credits to comply. So that has to be very, very carefully managed. And also the Commission has indicated that they're not very positive at all to importing credits. So this, of course, leaves us with a question: how are they going to do in the future? Because the discussion is unavoidable. Shall we have a zero cap? And if we do have a zero cap, then how should that be handled? Okay, I'll hand over to Milan now.
Yes, thanks very much, Lars. So what I'd like to talk about now corresponds roughly to the third chapter of our book, and it's about national policies on ETS sectors that therefore interact with the European system. And maybe the first thing to say about these policies is that while they indeed are overlapping, they are also in a way unavoidable, and you could also argue that some of them should be encouraged. Why are they unavoidable? Well, it's also because some countries make the domestic and unilateral decision to move faster than the EU average. It might change a little bit with the updated EU targets now, but still there are countries, also Sweden and Finland, for example, that want to reach climate neutrality before 2050. And therefore also have higher intermediate targets. And for now, it is still the easiest to reduce emissions in the power sector first. So also from this country's perspective, it simply might make sense to have some additional policies there. And I'd just like to discuss a few now. The first is perhaps a bit awkwardly, but still an example from the United Kingdom. They are even today still part for another few weeks of the EU ETS, and they've always been a significant component of the European system. And they were one of the first ones to really have an ambitious national policy that was really designed from the get-go to come on top of the European system. So they introduced a carbon price floor more than 5 years ago already. And what they did was they looked at what the average price in the past year was in the EU, and then decided to add a top up to that. And then over time, the average price for UK electricity generators should be a given minimum level. And this started fairly low, but has also been increasing, so that de facto, for some time, the carbon price in the UK really has been equivalent to 30 euros for a few years longer already before the EU ETS reached those prices. And since there is a little bit of a lag in when this national carbon price level gets updated, the effective carbon price in the UK has been even higher, more close to say 40 to 50 euros per ton. And what this has done has really been quite remarkable, because over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we have really seen an enormous reduction in coal-fired power generation in the UK, even to the point where we have seen headlines that the coal use in electricity generation in the UK is now down to levels last seen in the late 19th century. So really a reversal of the industrial revolution, or rather a new one, towards gas and renewables. So the impact of this higher price has been significant, and it's perhaps a little bit less important today because right now the EU ETS price is a lot higher, around 30 euros, than it was in 2015. But it has really allowed the UK to decarbonize its electricity sector at a very rapid pace. Another example, more on a very different side of sort of where additional policies can take place, has been the renewable energy law in Germany, the Erneuerbare Energiegesetz, which is also quite an old policy already, but has had a huge impact as well. So from for about 15 years, German taxpayers have had to pay a little bit extra for their electricity bill, but those extra levies were then used to really have a policy-driven market for renewables at a time when renewables were not very competitive yet. And this has been one of the main driving factors in getting the costs of, for example, solar PV or also wind power really down by a lot, which by now have made them a lot more competitive. So this came at a cost. I mean, there was a strong distributional impact for German taxpayers, but you could also argue that the entire world now has been benefiting from these subsidies that were given to renewables in Germany. Another example from Germany is a bit more recent, and that is the fact that they want to keep a degree of control in what happens with the coal-fired power generation in the country. Of course, that is affected by the ETS as a whole, and therefore it's not completely in their control. But irrespective of the ETS, the German policymakers decided to have a gradual phase out, also giving some compensation to both hard coal and lignite plant owners, so that there is a degree of control in when that happens. This, of course, has a significant impact on the ETS because if you retire a power plant earlier than sort of is necessary because of the market, you might create additional surplus measures. And the same goes for what the UK did. If you have a higher domestic carbon price, you simply drive down emissions sooner, but then unless you make an adjustment to the supply, you create a little bit of additional imbalances. And this is also something that Lars will talk about then. What do you need to do to keep the market in balance then? A final example is also quite recent and actually has not materialized yet, but it is really part of ongoing political discussions in the Netherlands now. And that is to have a similar system as, say, the UK has for its power plants, but then even apply to industry. So to decide what will be an appropriate level of a carbon price for Dutch domestic industry, and then look at what the EU price is and add an additional levy. In the case of the Dutch proposal, this is a bit more sensitive because with industry, you're also dealing with trade exposed sectors, and therefore you need to be a bit mindful of the waterbed effect. And this is also something that Lars will talk about. So handing back to you now.
Okay, thank you, Milan. Yes, this issue about supply and demand imbalances, it's not new. The ETS was suffering under very low price for about 6 years, starting around 2012. And the reason for this was there was a great influx of credits, mainly from China, but also that there was the recession that created a surplus, the recession in 2008 that created a surplus of allowances. It was really hard to get rid of this surplus, but the problem with the emissions trading system is if you create a surplus, for instance, through these additional emission reductions on the national level, you reduce emissions in those countries and emissions go down, but then you create this surplus that can be used by other member states under the same system. And this is sometimes referred to as the waterbed effect. It's like sitting down on one side of the waterbed and seeing the other side going up. Now, this is of course problematic because the price almost crashed. It was down to less than €3, and of course that was not creating the incentives for adoption of low carbon technologies. And also it sort of accelerated this will in member states to introduce alternative policies. So the MSR was introduced, the Market Stability Reserve. It was introduced in 2019, and it works as a bank. So a part of the surplus that is created by these emission reductions or by other mechanisms, a part of that surplus, 24%, is transferred into this Market Stability Reserve. And then after a few years, a large part of this surplus is cancelled and can't come back to the market. And there's been different estimates now showing that somewhere between 2 and 3 billion tons of allowances will be cancelled in 2023. And that has led already to a significant price increase, which is contributing to pushing out coal-based power in the EU. So when we had this new effect from the corona pandemic, this question was, will that also lead to a price crash? And Milan and I have done some modeling on this, and what we can see is that this MSR seems to be able to suck up the extra allowances that have come out from the corona pandemic, and these will also be cancelled in 2023, at least most of it. But what is of concern is that the year after, in 2024, the rules say that this transfer rate of surplus allowances into the MSR will be reduced to 12% per year. And that seems to be, or it will be, too low in order to stop this surplus from growing again. So if nothing is done about this, this will lead to probably a new fall in price. So it's clear that the Market Stability Reserve has to be updated, and a possibility to do this is in 2022, when there's going to be a review of the MSR. So the most obvious thing to do is to keep this higher transfer rate, 24%, but you can also look at other options. We think that introducing a price floor in the EU ETS would be a good way to maintain a certain minimum level of the carbon price. This has been used in for instance, the emissions trading system in California, Quebec, and it's provided certainty for investors that they know that the price will stay at a certain level. But it's not clear that. I mean, it's a contentious issue in Europe. There are some critics against the price floor, but also some people that strongly advocate introduction of a price floor. I think we may return to this discussion after the presentations. Okay, I'll leave back to you.
Yes, so now we move from sort of issues more dealing with the fundamentals and price to the cost issue. And this is always a major part of any reform discussion, and most probably it will be the same once the Commission introduces its new ideas next summer. But there are some fundamental choices to be made, because in a way free allocation is not sustainable in the long run, for the basic reason that you run out of the supply of free allowances to give away. And if you would create additional supply, then this would come at a cost of either the effectiveness of the system, or it would really be a de facto huge distributional transfer. So in a way, this has been recognized, and there is a much discussed proposed alternative now, and that is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Basically, the idea that you levy a tax or something equivalent to a tax on imports on the basis of their carbon contents. This is intuitively a very attractive instrument, also one that is widely accepted in its logic as being necessary to sort of level the playing field. But its design is very complicated, and I'd just like to highlight 3 issues that might prove to be very difficult to overcome. The first is the use of revenues. So in the EU debate so far, the carbon border adjustment mechanism has also been linked to the general effort of the European Green Deal and the EU budget, and it is then seen as a way to raise own resources for the EU budget. And the issue is that internationally, or beyond the borders of the EU would need to sell sort of politically this idea to its trade partners, and also argue that it is compatible with the World Trade Organization rules. But if you then domestically discuss the mechanism as contributing to your own fiscal revenue, then it becomes very easy to argue for your trade partners that you don't actually have an environmental objective at all, but rather it's about either your own competitiveness or your own fiscal resources. So this will be something that needs to be addressed, and one way to do that is to be very intelligent about how you use the revenues, more in a way that benefit global decarbonization, or for example, international climate financing. That will be a way to diffuse that. Another sensitive issue is exports. It is in principle possible to apply this border adjustment also to exports by rebating the costs of the ETS. But then you also have a very politically sensitive issue, because that might be construed as export subsidies, which are very difficult to justify under the WTO. And finally, there is a huge political decision to make whether this carbon border adjustment mechanism would be an alternative to free allocation or a complement to it. And here, industry tends to have quite different views from policymakers, in that they see it as also being on top of the free allowances, and saying that that is necessary because the free allocation will be declining over the next 10 years, so you need something extra. But if you combine the two, then again, you might be running into trouble at the WTO, because it could be construed as being more about industrial competitiveness rather than mitigating carbon leakage risk only. So maybe to summarize here, carbon leakage risk mitigation and safeguarding industrial competitiveness, they do overlap, but they are not wholly the same. And it is not always possible for your instruments to tackle both at the same time. So some political choices need to be made there. And there are also alternatives. The consumption charges are one, which would operate more a bit like a VAT on the carbon contents, applied to both domestic and imports. But also industrial policy in itself could be seen as something that improves the competitiveness of European industry. So with that, I'll go to the next one, which is about the question of extension. So should more sectors be added? Right now we have electricity generation, energy-intensive industry, and aviation, although only intra-EU aviation. So the first sector that is usually mentioned in this debate is maritime emissions. And there is quite a bit of consensus that yes, they should be added, but then the question is how. So what scope of emissions? And it's a little bit similar to the debate about aviation. Do you only want to include ships on routes that both depart and arrive in the EU, or anything including, say, the ships that depart from Shanghai? And there might be some challenges there related to what if they make a quick stopover in either London or North Africa and then go to the EU? Is that a way to avoid the EU regulation then? The Green Deal also mentions road transport and energy use in buildings to be included, or another way to frame this would be just to talk about all fossil fuels that are combusted should be included in the ETS somehow. This is much more contested because the customer or consumer facing sectors, more regular citizens rather than big companies, and the impact of the carbon price might not be enough to really affect change in these sectors. Another way to look at it is that you should always, when talking about extension, consider the impact on the ETS as a whole. So if, say, extension to road transport would not lead to additional reductions there, it might still increase demand for allowances, and then you might get additional reductions in the power sector. Another thing to consider is what happens to effort sharing. This is the non-ETS climate policy framework, and the benefit of that is that it has allowed for a degree of differentiation where countries with relatively lower GDP levels are also allowed to have a little bit more space in their carbon targets. They have to reduce by less, and that can be important to generate political support for higher climate targets, such as we have seen with the European Council last week. And if you change that, then it might be difficult to differentiate between countries if you have a single cap. With that, I think I will hand back over.
Thank you very much, Lars and Milan, for the introduction to the book and the presentation. And as we know, there's a lot of content in these two chapters. There's a lot of relevance. So I highly recommend anyone who found this interesting to go online and order the book or download it right away. We're going to get some comments from our panelists. And first off, we have Elina Kinsey, who is co-founder and energy market specialist at ELS Analysis. So Elin, please give us your thoughts on the presentation and on the publication.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure to read the report, which I thought was very interesting and indeed very topical as we are heading into this busy period of overlooking the EU ETS next year in line with the EU climate targets for 2030 and 2050. So I thought I'd give more of a market perspective and sort of pick up on the issues that was raised in the report, but from a market perspective. So I'll give a few observations from this year, which has been an exceptional year for the carbon market, not just the carbon market, but markets in general, very much due to the COVID pandemic, but there's been some specific factors that is quite telling about the carbon market and what we could expect as we are moving into the next phase. So, and I'll just finish up with a bit of an outlook, and I'll pick up on some of the mechanisms that we believe are highly important while overlooking the EU ETS and what could drive prices in the future. So many of the issues discussed in the report are price drivers for the carbon market. And there is, of course, a very strong linkage between carbon price movements and EU climate policies. So, and we have especially seen that this year. So any announcement coming out from Brussels regarding especially tightening the 2030 reduction target to at least 55% has been a very bullish factor for the EU carbon price. So we've been seeing carbon pricing trading at about 31 euro per ton as a direct result of these sort of announcements. And I think this is telling us that the sentiment in the market is very much focusing on long-term climate objectives. And that also gives a sense that the market also believe that the ETS and the sectors within it will do some heavy lifting when it comes to meeting the 2030 targets and the ultimate 2050 target. If we then compare that to when the market rather has reshifted its focus towards pure fundamentals, we have seen prices rather trade around 23 to 25 euro per ton. And this is where the market has more or less been balanced. And I know that everyone would say that, okay, but we have the COVID effect, but this was the price levels we saw even in the beginning of the year. So I would say that there is obviously a premium connected to the policy announcements that have been coming out. And I think this is a very important factor when we are overlooking the EU ETS in the future, because it will be very important to center the discussion around fundamentals and make sure that the market is actually balanced in the future, which was also commented earlier by some of the speakers. So if we are looking a bit further ahead, then what do we expect when we are looking at price forecasts and our balances? Well, we are overviewing the cap, the linear reduction factors you discussed earlier. It's currently at it will be on 2.2%. We expect that percentage to increase quite significantly in order to reach the 2030 target. I think we have estimated around 6% in order to actually meet those targets. This will have a huge impact on prices from 2024 and onwards. So we expect this factor alone to have a great impact on prices the coming decade. The other factor, of course, which was also brought up earlier, is the overlooking the intake rate for the MSR. If we add that to the strengthening of the cap, we are seeing prices rise even more. So for this reason, so what effect will this have on sectors within the ETS? So we expect coal to be phased out quite quickly and rapidly in the power sector, which means that industries will play a much more important role going forward. And the abatement costs for industries are much higher, so that will also play into this fact that we have a very high level of prices in the end of the decade. And I think this raises the questions about free allowances, how will they be handled under the new framework, and the risk of carbon leakage. And I think that is an issue that we'll come back to in the discussion. So I think I'll leave it there and look forward for some more thoughts in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elin. I think it's really good we have the market perspective in this seminar, so we'll also get that view on the pricing of the ETS. We're going to hand over to Susanna Karp for some further comments on the book, and then we're going to go into the panel discussion. And we have a few questions from the audience regarding some of the topics we've been talking about. So we'll take those in a minute. But first, we're going to hand over to Susanna.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Congratulations on the report. It is not just very timely, but it is also extremely thorough. And I very much enjoyed the questions that it asked, but also the depth of the solutions that it addresses. And I think it's important when we're in this optimistic mindset of the EU Green Deal, that it's easy to fantasize about all the possible reforms we could have to all the policies that have perhaps not been in the past as ambitious as we would have liked them to be. But it's just so important to understand what the different policy options actually do and how they interact. And so for this, I found the report extremely beneficial and useful. So congratulations for that. I want to maybe start my intervention from the Paris Agreement, not just because we've celebrated 5 years of it over the weekend, but also because we have already had an ETS revision since then. And I think that is quite important because although not everything that needed to change for the ETS to be in line with the Paris Agreement was changed the last time around, some elements were indeed introduced, which do guarantee at least parts of the compatibility with the Paris Agreement. I'm here referring in particular to the Msr Cancellation Mechanism, which does ensure that the ETS is looking towards a carbon neutral second half of the century. Prior to the introduction of this mechanism, we were expecting allowances to be returned to the market from the MSR into the 2080s. So I think this element is incredibly important. And of course, while we move towards the upcoming revision and we need to look into perhaps the elements which are not compatible with the Paris Agreement, but I think it's important to actually start by mentioning that there are reforms that we need to keep. And so also the presentation referred to this and the importance of this mechanism, as well as the continuation of the double intake rate of the MSR. But of course, that will depend on the supply and demand balance. And so we'll have to look at that when we get to the revision. But I did want to start with the MSR cancellation mechanism because it also has an important role to play in the interactions that we're talking about. For a very long time in the EU, there was this idea that interactions between policies or that they were bad and they had a negative effect on the EU ETS. But it's also quite clear that without interactions between policies, we're not going to win this race against time towards 2050. So if anything, we need to actually harness positive interactions between policies. We need to have policies that catalyze other policies. So we need to have accelerator policies. And so in that sense, I think the ETS can play this role towards 2050. I perfectly agree with Milan's assessment that it can't be the only policy. It can continue to be a centerpiece policy. It doesn't need to be the only one, but nonetheless, for it to continue to have this relevant role that we see is listed in the EU Green Deal as well, the MSR cancellation mechanism needs to continue. What this mechanism does is it also turns the ETS into what I have called in the past a live map. So all of a sudden, from a stagnant carbon market, we've moved towards something that has become a bit of a different mechanism. It's a flexible, it's a self-adjusting policy instrument. And that is quite critical when you look at the theory of systems. You always need an element that somehow creates self-adjustments. And this is what the MSR does. So before we jump ahead and play a little bit with the LRF and all the other elements, I just want to stress this, this element that it will be relevant going towards 2050, possibly, you know, as we're going to approach years with massive reduction rates, hopefully, if we're serious about meeting our 2050 goal. But we're going to have years where maybe the drop rates will be 4% or 5% into the 2040s. And you can't really have a carbon market that sustains that unless it can self-adjust and cancel or react in some sort of manner. Indeed, what I liked very much about the study and the presentation just now is that it talks about companion policies. And that's a very nice way of referring to this aspect of interaction. In the past, we've had overlapping policies or contradictory policies or competing policies. But I think companion policies is probably a better way to look at it. And maybe the ETS can be a companion policy to all the other national policies. So maybe the ETS becomes the companion policy par excellence, that it then supports rapid deployment of policies at national level. Because a lot will have to be done at national level. So there's no question about that, but a supporting policy would help. Now, of course, not all policies are equal. So, for example, I think it's important to refer to the policy that Milan brought up, which is the system in the Netherlands with regards to industrial decarbonization. That sort of policy system within a system, really, but is critical for reaching the 2030 targets and, of course, for reaching the 2050 targets. It is absolutely clear that the EU ETS has delivered for the power sector, and it is equally clear that it has not delivered for the industry sectors. And so a system such as the Dutch proposed system, which I very much hope it goes ahead, would be a nice complement to the ETS to actually harness exactly those positive interactions between the two and have deployment of innovation at scale. For us to reach our 2030 targets, I think we should be aiming for 40% reductions in the industrial sectors. And while that's ambitious for 2030, unless we do that, I'm afraid the rest of the trajectories will look perhaps too ambitious for just 2 decades. Okay, and perhaps I will wrap up with the discussion on the ambition increase announcement that was made last week. Of course, I suspect many of us in this field understand that it's not as drastic of a reduction trajectory when it's a net target, but so far it's been announced as an emissions reduction target. So I suspect the net was possibly a mistake because all the announcements speak of an emissions reduction target. If that's the case, it's true that the balance between ETS and non-ETS is really important, but it was really important before that as well. And we're not going to necessarily fix the issue with the different sectorial trajectories, different landscapes for decarbonization just by putting everything into the EU ETS. This is beyond simplistic. It's an approach that I'm surprised to see returning to the European debate. But it's a necessary discussion to have simply because it's true that the non-traded sectors were in a difficult situation under the effort sharing. So in fact, we should be talking about effort sharing, a very serious effort sharing revision and finding ways to help those sectors. What does 55% mean for the EU ETS? As Elin mentioned, it could mean an LRF above 6% or 7%, unless there is a rebasing in 2026. But nonetheless, we can only really know that if the target is absolute. So I very much hope that we will have the possibility to use real numbers and very thorough modeling in the discussions coming up for the ETS, and that will require a clear target for reductions. So I think that's all from my side. I'm very happy to join the debate, answer questions. Yes, and take commentaries, criticism.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for those comments. We're going to bring Elin back, and I'm going to hand over to Lars and Milan so they can give some responses. Some of the questions that have shown up from the audience relates to a lot of what you said, and specifically, there's a lot of questions around: is there a need for the market stability reserve if we have an increase or an aggressive linear reduction factor, and how do those things play with each other, so to speak? If we have a sharp decline in the linear reduction factor or an increase in ambition, so to speak, do we need the MSR still? So that is perhaps something you could take up in your remarks. You're free to comment on Elin and Susanna's remarks as you would like. Would Lars like to start?
Well, that's, of course, we don't know if we're going to hit the correct linear reduction factor if we put it at 6% or something else. So I think there needs to be some more adjustment mechanism, and the MSR is what we have now. So the logic is to keep on with that. But I mean, personally, I've always liked the price floor because the MSR is very complex, and even for the best modelers and analysts, it's hard to say exactly what the effect is from the MSR. Some say that it may lead to strategic behavior because it plays in strange ways. So it's hard to see the exact effect from the MSR, even as it looks now.
Thank you. Milan, do you want to comment on the same thing?
Yeah, maybe I'd give a pretty sort of fundamental answer. I would always be in favor of something like the MSR because we know that demand will always be elastic and flexible, especially with a lot of 27 different national policies interacting and economic developments, etc. And it's unnatural for a market to have a completely rigid supply then. So whatever you want to do, you need some way of adjusting the supply also in the short term, and not just by having a 2-year legislative process to changes in demand.
Thank you. I would like to get Elin and Susanna's view on the price floor question. Should we have an EU ETS price floor? Do you have any thoughts about that? And does it replace the MSR? There seems to be a lot of support for the MSR in this panel, so to speak. But could we replace it with a price floor? Do we need both to keep the flexibility in the system? Would any of you would like to start? Susanna, go ahead.
Thank you. I've been a very long advocate of a carbon floor price in the EU ETS, and I obviously am in favor of it. I haven't changed my mind very much, but the question is it as vital as it was perhaps back in 2017, 2018? In principle, looking ahead, it doesn't seem to be so vital. So if we do want to speak of one, I think it would just be wise policymaking to try to safeguard the investments we're making today, towards the next 10 years. Of course, it would be very wise to have a floor price and to have it increase on a clear trajectory. That could only help. But I would be wary of having a EU debate centered on that because of the trade-offs that may occur. So I don't want to end up in a fake trade-off between another useful policy and the floor price, because they just achieve different objectives.
Do you agree, Elin? From the market perspective, do they want to have a price floor to have the clear signal from the investment? Is it needed?
Well, it seems like it's a bit of a divided camp here. Either you're for or against, and I would say I have no strong feelings about either of them. But I think what Susanna said is my view exactly. I think it lost its relevance. I think when UK introduced it, it was very efficient. However, now when we are looking at prices, there are so many other factors that are pushing prices up to very high levels in this decade. So the cost of, the industry, abatement cost for industries will be such a price driver going forward. So I don't think I'm not against it in any way, but I just don't see that it's well needed. Plus, it's been very divided opinions about the price floor within member states. So having that discussion once again, when the benefits of it would be rather limited,
Of course, the political viability and so on plays into this. How viable is it to actually get a price floor, and do we need a discussion? So thank you very much. We're actually getting very close to 1 o'clock, so we're going to have to round off pretty shortly. But I would like to raise another question that comes from the audience, and that is the question of including other sectors. Should the ETS be expanded, and which sectors are the first one to go? Milan, you gave a few thoughts in your presentation. So maybe Lars, I suspect you agree with Milan, but could you complement anything that he said about the inclusion of other sectors?
Well, very shortly, I think it's hard to include transportation in the EU ETS because it's a local issue mainly. There's a lot of national policies towards transportation, like local air pollution and congestion and other issues. So I think that would come, of course, with a lot of considerations of how to do it. But of course, the logic is that the transport sector is becoming more and more electrified, and electricity is in the ETS. So indirectly, it is linked to the ETS. But still, I think it's hard to see that road transportation will be included.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to hear what Susanna or Elin has to say about it.
Yes, of course. So Susanna, please, would you like to give your thoughts?
Well, so I agree with what was just said. We are looking to electrify transport in the European Union. So indirectly, transport would end up in the EU ETS. It could be that at some point after 2030, where let's say half of transport is electrified, the other half isn't, we might want to move everything into the EU ETS. But of course, so it's as we know, it's done in other carbon markets, such as in California. But it's really an issue of can you still have separate targets and dedicated policies for those sectors, because they do require attention that is specific to the infrastructure of those sectors. So if it's possible to keep both, then in principle, after 2030, it could be indeed a wise thing to do. However, if it's not possible to keep both, given that transport will become electrified in any case, why bother right now?
Elin, do you have any thoughts on the subject of sectors to include?
No, I agree with the challenges ahead, but I would just say that if we decide to go for an inclusion, I think it would be very useful to I think the report is highlighting how important parallel national legislations are, or regulations for this. So I think we should, in that case, run it parallel with the EU ETS until we can see that the combination and harmonization with other sort of national policies would work, and then include it in the EU ETS, so we do not disturb the EU ETS as it finally is working. So that would be my only take on that.
Thank you. We have run out of time, unfortunately. So I'm going to have to say thank you to Lars and Milan for writing this excellent publication. I really think it gives a really good view of what the challenges to come, and a good forward-looking perspective on the EU ETS. And Susanna and Elin, thank you so very much for participating and giving your thoughtful comments on the publication. It's really valuable. And to all of you who have watched, please go to foros.se and order the book or download it for free right now. And you can read it there, and you're very welcome to contact us if you have any questions. And thank you for your comments and questions in the comment section as well. And with that, I would just like to say happy holidays and take care, and have a nice day, everyone. Bye.